Good evening, everybody. Let's get started. We are a little bit late because we are waiting still for the second speaker, and we thought she might arrive in time for also the first presentation. We are hopeful that she will still come, but want to start already because it's late. So the topic of what seems to be the last session of the lecture series is the EU and the future of international climate protection. And basically we know that today I think we are in a different position than we were a week ago. There has been the conference in Poznan, which was in the news. There has obviously been the agreement on the climate and energy package in the European Council, and I think the European Parliament is set to vote tomorrow or Thursday at the latest. Thursday now? Today. They did it?
Yes. Today.
Ah, today is Wednesday, right? Wednesday. I'm 1 day behind. Tuesday. So it's approved. Okay, that I hadn't even seen on the news yet. What we'll do in this session now is, I think, basically look, as the title says, on the role of the EU in the future of the international climate protection. So I guess mainly what will happen towards Copenhagen and what the prospects are after Poznan, what happened in Poznan. And I'm very glad that Nicola Notaro of the European Commission of DG Environment, the unit that is responsible for the international negotiations, is with us to present us his views on what Poznan brought and what the way forward will be. Before giving the floor to him, I would like to make one announcement that I already, I think, told you that would come, and that is about the lecture that's indicated in the program for January by Josta Beke in the program as Acting Director General of DG Environment. In January he's back to Deputy Director General. And he will come on the 21st of January and talk about the EU climate and energy package, the internal and external implications. So while we'll focus, I assume, more on Poznan today and on Copenhagen, then in January we'll get his views on the EU climate and energy package. 21st of January in room 003 in this building, that's next door, basically. I guess registration for that event should be open, well, check our website. We'll try to make that work as of tomorrow, I would hope. And then please register and spread the word, and we'll also send out email invitations still. So that's the program. So today's session is somehow the last session, but not really the last session. Yes, please?
It'll be at 6 o'clock as well?
It's at 6 o'clock, yeah, sorry. I forgot to mention that. But I'll probably make the announcement once more at the end if more people show up. 6 o'clock, 21st of January, room 003. So, with that, let's turn to the assessment of Poznan and what's going to come. Please, Nicola, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sebastian, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks to you for coming here to listen to me at this late hour. What I will do is I will just very briefly recall the background, I mean the framework within which we operate in terms of climate policy, but rather quickly, and then focus indeed on the outcome of Poznan and the prospects for Copenhagen. You're probably familiar with the provision which is shown on the screen now. It's Article 174 of the treaty. Yeah, one of the objectives of European environmental policy, the last one on the screen, is really the basis for us to take action at the international level. That's where EU competence, if you like, in terms of international environmental issues is based on. And climate change is, of course, a global problem. No solution can be found by individual countries or even regions without international cooperation. And those provisions also list the principles which are relevant to environment policy in general, and of course to climate change as well. probably two principles that are more relevant to climate change. I think we're shifting from precaution to prevention nowadays, in the sense that the level of scientific uncertainty in relation to climate change is reducing, particularly after the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year. And we are more and more sure of the fact that climate change is humanly induced, and therefore what we're trying to do is essentially prevention activities, prevention of the worst consequences of climate change. So those two they're all relevant, these principles, to climate policy, but those two principles are particularly relevant. What is the framework in which we operate? I think I give you a little reminder. There is the UNFCCC, so the Convention on Climate Change, and its Kyoto Protocol. The Convention is, of course, a legally binding treaty, but with rather soft obligations. There are no strong binding obligations in the conventions, except for the need for developed countries and developing countries to develop national programs and policies on climate change and to provide reports. And there was also a strong encouragement to industrialized countries to stabilize their emissions by the year 2000 compared to the year 1990. It's a non-binding goal that the EU countries have achieved, others like the US have not. And then, of course, the Kyoto Protocol developed over the years and then adopted in '97. And the protocol is much more focused on emissions reduction and mitigation commitments by industrialized countries that in climate jargon are called the Annex I countries. And the overall aggregate effort that developed countries have undertaken by signing up to the Kyoto Protocol is not very significant in terms of the policy debate on climate nowadays. It's a 5.2% overall aggregate reduction, but it's a fundamental first step. It's the first agreement in which legally binding targets for developed countries have been agreed, and indeed it's leading us, as we'll see in a moment, towards hopefully much more ambitious targets. How does the EU work within the framework of the Kyoto Protocol? It's also important to recall. We work, in fact, in two different ways, and somehow in two different groups, in the sense that the EU was EU15 at the time of ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. So the EU15 member states have decided to deliver on their targets all together in what is called in jargon the EU bubble. So we have a regional agreement that we have agreed to deliver a common reduction, a joint reduction of 8% compared to 1990 levels. Of course, we have put this in EC law when we ratified the Kyoto Protocol. The other member states, the new member states of the EU, they have their own targets under the treaty, which actually I would say they're able to deliver relatively easily because the 10 member states who have targets, particularly I'm speaking about member states from Eastern Europe, because of course of the industrial decline that took place after the fall of communism. So their economies went through a crisis, a crash, and therefore emissions reduced very much. There are two member states who have no targets under the Kyoto Protocol, and these are Malta and Cyprus. So at that time, they did not commit to any target. So this is the framework. This is how we operate under the Convention and the Kyoto Protocol in broad terms. Now, as I said, this 5.2% aggregate targets in terms of the emission reductions that are necessary to effectively fight climate change is very low. It's too low and it's insufficient. There's been growing awareness of the need to go beyond this, essentially coming from the scientific community, but this has fortunately also spilled over into the wider public with a growing awareness among all of us. And therefore political pressure has increased to go beyond and to take much bolder action to fight climate change. This political momentum has built up throughout, particularly the year 2007, and at the end of 2007, in the Bali Conference of the Parties last year, there was an agreement for a negotiation mandate for a new agreement on climate change. And this agreement should be concluded by December 2009, so by the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen. We have 1 year left. And the negotiations are based on the so-called Bali Action Plan. It's a negotiation mandate adopted at the Bali Conference. Within the Bali Action Plan, I'll recall briefly the main elements that are being negotiated. We have so-called 5 building blocks. We have a shared vision. It's the vision that parties have for the future climate regime that should take over somehow from the Kyoto Protocol as of 2013. And the EU view on the shared vision has been laid out in European Council conclusions, so at the highest political level by heads of states and governments. And this vision is essentially based on the so-called 2 degrees target. The 2 degrees target is based on science, it's essentially based on the IPCC findings, and it's the idea that if we want to prevent the most dangerous, most catastrophic consequences of climate change, we should indeed limit the increase of global average temperature to 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Now, even if this objective is kept, even if the 2 degrees is the ceiling that is respected, there will be negative consequences of climate change. There are already, of course, and are affecting all countries in different ways. But hopefully we'll be able to avoid the most catastrophic consequences of climate change. So this concept, this target, is the centerpiece of the European vision for the new climate agreement that should be agreed in a year from now. In order to achieve that, of course, there are concrete emission reductions commitments that are necessary. And there are lots of figures that you see on the screen, and of course for those of us that work in this field on a daily basis, this is a bit our daily bread, but they are important figures to retain. There is a long-term goal which the whole world community should commit to in order to have a chance to respect this 2 degrees target. And this is the reduction of emissions by 50% by mid-century, by 2050, always compared to the baseline of 1990. This is an aspirational goal that the EU is trying to push all countries to commit to. But then, of course, if you want to achieve such a bold reduction, think in terms of proportion with the 5% under the Kyoto Protocol at present, and this is 10 times higher. Of course, you would have to have and to achieve mid-term targets, and that's why we have proposed for ourselves and for other developed countries intermediate targets for the year 2020, so in the next 12 years. And these targets are a reduction of emissions for the EU unilaterally, so whatever happens with the international agreement, a reduction of 20%. And then in the framework of an international agreement, a reduction of 30%. So these are the objectives which have been set out by the European Council. Now, this is one, and maybe the most important building block of the Bali Action Plan that has kind of cross-cutting character because it underpins all the rest of the negotiation mandate. But of course, there are many more details thereunder. I've been speaking about mitigation actions, emission reduction commitments. If you look at the first small bullets on the screen, you see the EU is pushing for developed countries to commit to significant cuts, and indeed our objective is that everybody, the whole group of developed countries, will be able to deliver altogether a reduction of 30%. But nowadays emissions are very high also from emerging economies. You might be aware of the fact that at least as far as CO2 is concerned, China is almost overtaken the US, becoming the largest emitter, and of course large emissions coming from other emerging economies like India, South Africa, Brazil, and so on. So if we want to be effective in the fight against climate change, we need mitigation action to happen also in developing countries and also by the growing emerging economies. Now, of course, we have to be fair here. We have to look back and who is responsible for climate change. We have to face historical responsibilities. And of course, in the last 150 years, it has been the industrialized countries who have essentially caused the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We cannot ignore that. So we cannot expect that developing countries would take up the same type of action as the one that we are demanding from developed countries. So the idea that is still in the making, I must say, because this is very much subject to negotiation at present, is that developing countries would contribute with domestic action to emission reductions. And some recent scientific studies indicate a figure which would be a reduction of 15 to 30% of their emissions below business as usual. What does it mean? If you have a diagram and you look at the emissions of developing countries nowadays, and the emissions are like this, a reduction of 15 to 30% below business as usual would mean that their emissions would continue to grow, but would grow like this. So it's a reduction of the rate of increase of their emissions. The emissions still grow, but more slowly than they would have been under a business as usual scenario. And this is linked to the fact I mentioned before. We need to be fair. These countries are in the development phase. And so it's, of course, understandable that their emissions will continue to grow. But if the growth is unlimited, then we will just not be able to tackle climate change effectively. So this is, of course, a very, very controversial element of the negotiations, of which many nights of sleep will be lost in the next year, I'm pretty sure. Then, of course, essential elements for achieve mitigation relate to the strengthening of the global carbon market. If you have followed the discussion on the climate energy package that was mentioned before, you know there is a reformed ETS, European Emission Trading System, which is at present the main element of the global carbon market. The global carbon market is still very much in the making. Beyond the European ETS, there is, in fact, very little. But if, for instance, the US develops, as apparently it is the intention of the President-elect Obama, a cap-and-trade system similar to the one of the EU, it's quite clear that the EU and the US together could build up something like 85% of the global carbon market, which, if it works properly, could deliver significant emission reductions. Then another important issue, which is being negotiated under the Bali Action Plan, concerns deforestation. The reduction of emissions from deforestation, particularly in tropical countries, in developing countries. Deforestation is the cause of about 20% of greenhouse gases emission nowadays. So if you want an agreement to be effective, you'll have to tackle the issue of deforestation, otherwise the agreement will not, is likely not to achieve its purpose. And the last element I wanted to mention in relation to mitigation concerns the transport sector and the emissions from maritime and aviation, international transport. In fact, those two sectors are not as such covered by the Kyoto Protocol, but there is a clause in the protocol that in fact requires parties to pursue a solution in relation to these two sectors in the framework of the International Maritime Organization and of the International Civil Aviation Organization. This seems logical in the sense that these bodies have specific competence, specific expertise in relation to these transport sectors. But the reality is that after about 10 years or more now, no concrete steps have been taken in either of these two bodies to address mitigation action in relation to aviation and the maritime sector. So this is very much an issue, again, under discussion in the climate negotiations. Hopefully, some level of ambition in terms of reduction of emissions can be agreed in these negotiations. Then the other three elements which are being negotiated, of course, adaptation. I mentioned before the fact that even if the 2 degrees target is respected, there will still be unavoidable consequences of climate change, and there is a need to adapt to them. And this need concerns all countries, concerns developed as developing countries. Of course, it's much easier for countries which are well off economically to face the consequences of climate change than it is for developing countries. And you'll have to think in particular of these developed countries, you'll have to think of African countries who have contributed very, very little or nothing to the climate change that is happening today, and will bear the brunt of the consequences of this extreme weather event that will become more frequent. So it's indispensable in order to have an effective agreement that there is funding, financial means, financial support directed towards these groups of countries to face the challenges of adaptation. And climate change is very much related, of course, to energy use and to technology. And the development, the deployment and transfer of technology will be essential in order to both put in place mitigation policies but also adaptation policies. That's why technology transfer as such is also one of the building blocks of the Bali Action Plan. And then I was anticipating it that there is the issue of finance, the issue of money. It's very clear that if financial support is not stepped up for developing countries, there will not be an agreement in Copenhagen in 1 year time. This is actually one of the clear messages that was reiterated also at the Poznan conference that just finished last week. And we'll have also to think in the longer term, as always is the case with environmental issues, environmental problems. What may seem prohibitive costs, if you take them in the short term, like spending 0.5 to 1% of the global GDP today to fight against climate change, well, it's in reality an investment for the future. And if climate change goes unmitigated, you probably heard a figure from the Stern report, for instance, last year on the costs of climate change. This could be as high as 5 to 20% of global GDP if climate change remains unmitigated. So it's an investment for the future, which of course is difficult to agree to for politicians who think of the next election. Because this is shorter, but if we think in the medium to long term, there is simply no other choice. So this is what we are negotiating. I don't think I need to tell you much more about the climate package, so I'll skip a few slides there, and I rather focus on Poznan and what has happened there. Well, the conference in Poznan had one big challenge, which was reaffirming political momentum for the climate negotiations. In the last few weeks and months, particularly since summer, with the worsening of the financial crisis, there was a lot of fear that the issue of climate change might be set aside, stripped away by the financial crisis and by immediate needs of our economies and the growing unemployment and all economic worries that we are witnessing today. Fortunately, this has not happened. There have been very strong political messages that have highlighted the fact that in time of crisis you have to invest in the economy to relaunch it, and if you want to make good investment, you have to invest in sustainable economy, and the fight against climate change is one such a type of investment. Particularly helpful, I must say, in relaunching the reaffirming momentum for the climate negotiation is the change of administration in the US, as you can, I guess, easily imagine. The President-elect Obama provided a speech, gave a speech a few weeks before Poznan, in which he underlined the beginning of a plan for reshaping US policy on energy and climate. And this is very promising, even though not as ambitious yet as we would like to see. And other personalities from the Democratic clan have also been present in Poznan, providing messages that contribute to keep up the momentum. So I have in mind John Kerry and of course Al Gore, who pushed all countries to be more ambitious in terms of climate policy. Obviously, from the European side, the adoption of the climate and energy package is a major contribution because it reinforces our credibility. You might have heard mixed messages about the outcome of these negotiations in the European Council, and messages also from green NGOs who are not happy with the result. I guess that's a normal part of European policy and decision making. But there is one thing that needs to be brought in mind, and it's that the targets that the EU has set, that were set in the Commission proposal in previous Council conclusions, the targets I mentioned of 20% reduction, 30% reductions, are ambitious and are there to stay. They are going to be part of European law and not simply of Council conclusions and political declarations. So of course there have been lots of compromises, flexibility, redistribution of several elements of the package between and among member states, but the overall level of ambition has been kept. And it's quite extraordinary, if any of you has any familiarity with the European decision-making process. Achieving this in about 11 months from the Commission proposal, in a first reading agreement with the European Parliament, in a time in which we are witnessing the worst financial crisis for decades, it's a quite exceptional result that certainly no other country or region has actually achieved at present. Of course, we need to deliver on now what we have put into the law, and that's the next challenge for the EU for the years to come. And moreover, bear in mind that the package is a first step. There will be other packages in the future, there will be more ambitious targets. This is a process, this is really at the beginning. So, what are the achievements of Poznan? Well, it was an intermediate meeting. It didn't really have that much to achieve in terms of high political objectives. So the expectations were not high, and the results are not particularly glamorous from a political point of view. There are two negotiation tracks under the current negotiations. One is under the convention, to which 192 parties have subscribed, and another track is under the Kyoto Protocol. And the important difference to bear in mind, of course, is that the US are a party to the convention, but not a party to the protocol. And this explains, to some extent, why we negotiate in parallel under these two treaties. The other element to bear in mind is that developing countries are particularly attached to the Kyoto Protocol because that's where developed countries have committed to binding targets. So developing countries try to keep this approach and to have it confirmed for the future, for the period post-2012 when the first commitment period under Kyoto will end and we should have another agreement or an amended Kyoto, we will see. So there is this dichotomy which is due to the different political objectives. On one hand, we want to keep the US in the loop, it's essential, of course, and on the other hand, developing countries want to make sure that they don't lose what they have achieved by committing industrialized countries to targets in the Kyoto Protocol. But be sure that if any agreement is found in December next year, this this agreement will have to be a single undertaking. There will have to be a combination of the two tracks together somehow at some point. So what are the next steps which have been agreed in terms of work program for the two tracks? There will be some kind of zero negotiation draft emerging around March at the next session. And then the real negotiation draft, which will look much more like a legal text, a draft treaty, is expected to emerge by the session in June. So time is very tight. There will be about 10 weeks of negotiations within the UN process next year. One, maybe the most important achievement of Poznan was the agreement of making the adaptation fund operational. The adaptation fund is a fund that aims at providing financial support for developing countries to adapt to climate change. The money that goes into it is generated by a levy, 2% levy, which is charged on on CDM projects, so the Clean Development Mechanism projects, whereby companies from the developed world, and mostly European nowadays, since the US is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol, invest in emission reductions in developing countries. And on this project there is a levy which is charged, it's 2%, and this money goes into the adaptation fund. There were a number of legal issues to be solved to make the fund operational, and an agreement of principle has been found, so we are now optimistic that the fund will finally be operational. There was another important financial issue that has not been resolved, and this is an extension of this levy of 2%, which I've just mentioned, to the other Kyoto mechanism. Under the Kyoto Protocol, you don't only have the Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM, you also have the Joint Implementation Mechanism, mainly aimed at economies in transition, countries from the former Soviet bloc, and also you have, of course, emission trading. And the idea pushed by the developing countries was the extension of this levy also to these other mechanisms in order to generate more funds. But this was opposed by the developed countries, including the EU, at least on our side for two reasons. One political reason is that it's very difficult to negotiate isolated elements of a financial package which should be agreed for the Copenhagen Agreement next year. Because basically you're agreeing to provide some financial support, but you don't know in exchange of what. On the other hand, it's also legitimate to try and increase funds for adaptation, because this is an urgent need now that cannot wait that long. But so there was no political support from developed countries for the reasons I've outlined. And then there is another reason as well, which is this is about maybe it's not the right economic approach, because what these levies do is to tax emission reductions rather than taxing pollution. So it would be maybe more interesting to try and impose some kind of financial obligation on the polluters directly rather than on this project. And this is an issue that is indeed under discussion. Then, of course, there have been a number of relatively minor achievements, some improvements to the governance of the CDM, which I've mentioned, an agreement on a program on technology by which 50 million will be dollars will be made available to developing countries. But I would say none of this is extremely significant politically. Apart, maybe it's worth mentioning the reporting and review issue. The reporting and review is a key element of the Kyoto Protocol, because if you don't have a system by which you can report and review what's been done, actually you cannot enforce the obligations that developed countries have undertaken. And the system has worked relatively well, but there are issues of inconsistencies or lack of financial resources for properly trained reviewers, and the decisions taken in Poznan trying to address these problems. And this is essential also in view of the future agreement. If you don't have the necessary resources devoted to monitor the implementation of the agreement, then it will be very difficult to make sure that obligations are respected, and then they are just obligation on paper. Okay, so I'll take you very quickly through the rest. Yes, one important element politically in Bosnia was the announcement by the Mexican government of their willingness to undertake a 50% reduction of their emission by the year 2050. So they are committing to this aspirational goal that the EU is also supporting. Then another positive development was that Malta took this opportunity to state publicly that they are ready to take up a target for the next commitment period. As I said before, Malta and Cyprus are the only EU member states who do not have a target. And then, of course, I think it's worth mentioning personalities like Pachauri, the Indian chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and Al Gore in their speeches. They made a strong plea for all countries to actually become more ambitious. The 2 degrees objective that I've mentioned is translated numerically into a concentration of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which is the so-called 450 ppms, 450 particles per million. What they suggested is to go to 350, so to take more ambitious target to limit more aggressively the emissions of all countries. Now, in this slide, of course, I will not take you through all of this. This is a list of meetings. These are the major appointments that the International Climate Agenda has next year. You will see there are about 10 weeks of negotiation within the UN process. Then there are ministerial meetings of all levels. There is the G8 process, the G20 process, the major economies process. There are initiatives of the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, particularly a ministerial meeting is expected, or rather heads of state meeting is expecting at the same time as the General Assembly next year in September. In fact, if you put all of this together, you get an idea that, first of all, the UN process is central, but negotiations in reality take place also outside the UN process, in other fora, and that could usefully contribute to find an agreement. And this is essential because the time for an agreement is so short. And then you also get an idea that this issue is so high on the political agenda nowadays that ministers and or heads of state are going to meet and discuss climate change virtually every month next year. Well, there are also the next 2 slides highlight what are on our side in the Commission the next step before Copenhagen. And these are no mystery, but it's maybe important for you to know that we are proposing a communication, we are putting forward a communication. Hopefully this will be adopted in January, that's at least the plans, in which we will outline the blueprint for the EU position for Copenhagen. So we will provide some more proposal now on details of our position, particularly in relation to the financial aspects and to the action by developing countries. And then, if everything goes well and this communication is adopted, the European Spring Council in March is expected to react to this communication, hopefully to endorse it by and large and to make it become a European position. But an important element for all of us next year working on the negotiation will be certainly outreach. Outreach to a number of countries, outreach to the US, particularly on the issue of the creation of a transatlantic carbon market, outreach to Japan, particularly to try and convince them that what we have put in place with the climate energy package is feasible for them as well. Outreach to Russia. Russia is committed to a 40% energy efficiency target they have determined for themselves, and we will see if they will be able to deliver. It would be, of course, very important if they were, because it's one of the most inefficient economies in the world in terms of energy use. And so if this self-set target was delivered, it could be an important contribution to the fight against climate change. But then, of course, we have to deal with many more countries. Mexico and Korea are nowadays OECD countries, and they should take up targets for the future. China, India, Brazil, South Africa, I mentioned them before, they should come up with mitigation actions as their contribution to the climate agreement. In fact, China and South Africa in particular have already put in place policies, particularly in terms of energy efficiency, which are expected to deliver some positive contribution, but we would like them to do more, and in particular to commit on the longer term, beyond 2010. For instance, that's the deadline of the present action envisaged by China. And then we have cooperation with China, which is undergoing on the issue of carbon capture and storage, CCS, which is this technology that allows you to capture emissions from coal or oil and store them underground. And similarly with South Africa. Yeah, maybe the last thing I mentioned on the countries is really India. India will be a very, very difficult negotiating partner. I mean, none of these will be easy, that's quite clear. But India will be very difficult because they are a significant polluter in terms of emissions, but at the same time they have low emission per capita, and they have 600 million people without electricity. So we have to face the fact that it's a country that needs to develop further and whose emissions will need to increase. So we'll have to see what is realistic in terms of emission reduction commitments, maybe self-set or on a voluntary basis on their side. And you see the poor teddy bear is not doing very well there in the slides. So I'm really through. This is the last one. In fact, I've covered this ground already. It's what is to be watched out for 2009. And it's again a bit of a list of meetings and appointments which will make our life hell next year, I'm afraid. So thanks for your attention, and well, I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you.
Thank you to have invited me to these lectures, your series. I understand that's the last one before holidays, Christmas holidays. As Nicola has really made a very broad picture of both the Bali, the Kyoto track, the whole set of the negotiation and the results of Poznan and what we are in front of us as a work program towards Copenhagen. So I have not to repeat all that, and I would maybe try to convey to you some kind of the thinkings, the commentaries out of what I've seen from the perspective of the negotiation. IDDRI has been involved quite a lot. If you look at our website, you will see how we have been trying to understand what was going on, to make some elements of analysis and proposals. At that stage, it was very interesting to be in Poznan to see, and I will try to mainly understand how to evaluate the concrete results, how to judge the forces and trends who were acting in the Poznan meeting. In a way, what is very repetitive from the Kyoto, from Kyoto 1997 to nowadays, and somehow what is new, and there were quite new things, of course. We could see that in Bali, but I think there are some confirmation, and of course some very new things that Nicola referred to, that of course the presence, even if it was a sort of virtual presence of the new administration, the main gaps and maybe the condition of success for Copenhagen. And I will look at, as Nicola has said, we have these two different tracks which are in a way awkward. The Kyoto set, which few numbers of countries really having ratified on the industrialized countryside, and in a way the stronger part finally of the climate scene. And as Nicola said, the Kyoto process is still a sort of the reference in terms of the targets and the commitment of industrialist countries. But at the same time, the Kyoto process is a process without developing countries needing to take commitments. The other track, the convention, is in a way, it's awkward again, the new one, even if it's sort of the premier legal framework in 1992. But it is renewed by the fact that we know, of course, that the main actors and the main polluters said US will not participate and integrate the Kyoto process, and we certainly want a different legal framework. And even from the different parts of the US, different forces and groups, the thing you never hear is that they would be ready to participate to the Kyoto process as it is. So in a way, we have these two tracks, and the forces and the trends within these two tracks are the same and quite different because of this historical past that Kyoto has produced. Maybe some words about now the concrete results on Poznan. They are quite meager. Of course, the main result, certainly the main political result, is that the work program from Poznan to Copenhagen has been agreed quite easily. That the chair of the long-term action plan, was the roadmap from Bali, is able to table two texts, one in March and one in June. He has found some liberty to do it in based on the submission of the countries, and there was there was some discussion, but very little discussion on this capacity now of the chair to propose a negotiating text. So we are from Poznan to Copenhagen in in the jargon of the negotiation into full negotiating mode. That was not clear in Poznan, it was still exchange of views. There were negotiations on specific points that Nicola has referred to, the adaptation fund, giving some kind of operationality to the adaptation fund, and some points of deciding on the share of the proceeds, the extension of the levy on the emission trading mechanism, if it was possible. But on the other aspect, it was basically not really negotiating a strong element of what would be a deal. So there was no negotiation in Poznan, if not in the Kyoto process, but on the convention process. But now we are, and we accepted that we have this year to negotiate, beginning with the next March meeting. Concrete result as well, this adaptation fund was a very, very huge battle. In a way, the traditional North-South divide, principally about the governance of this fund, developing countries wanting to have direct access to the adaptation funding on the basis that they consider that this money is their money, and that they should be in a majority position to decide how to spend this fund. And there was some tension on the developing side, and of course maybe the awkward thing is that really US was not negotiating in Poznan. Japan was quite discreet on a lot of issues, and the real industrial country and expert country who was speaking was finally Europe. Europe having been the sort of the leader to maintain at least the Kyoto process, but that was a price in Poznan, which that EU was really on the forefront of the negotiation in front of the G77 and other developing countries. But nevertheless, we have this adaptation fund, and it's very important. It creates, not legally, but politically, a sort of jurisprudence. You know, there is a lot of debate of where and how the funding of climate must be located and what is the governance of these firms. There was, of course, last year there was different proposals. One mainly coming from UK and other industrial countries to use World Bank as a sort of key actor in managing the funds for the energy transition, the mitigation aspects, as well as adaptation. And that really was rejected very strongly by developing countries in Poznan. And EU has agreed to the position of the G77, so that creates even a mood on how the finance discussion will be set in the future in Copenhagen and the governance, at least, of the finance. The second aspect of the concrete results, the political sort of, again, nothing was agreed on the share of proceeds, and it was certainly a sort of logical, because I think the Nicola argument was right, but not possible to agree such an important things without having a global package, a global deal. But nevertheless, again, that's very clear that the type of source of finance has been clearly indicated in a very broad consensus among developing countries and in the emerging countries participating to that consensus, that will be the emission, in a way, the sort of global base of mechanism has to be found to fund adaptation in the first sense and mitigation in developing countries. So there is a sort of perception that finance will be maybe different from what we had some years ago in 2001, in 2001, that in a way it was the central maybe discussion was on the commitments, finalizing the commitments and finalizing, try of course to have US still on board. But we can have a perception that of course the targets and the mitigation aspect will be very important, but we will not have any agreement without a finance dimension. And I will come back to that again later. How we can judge forces and trends. Forces clearly, compared to what was the Kyoto framework, the traditional one, we have now a very active, proactive developing countryside with not only this broad consensus, but clearly some countries in the emerging countries group, which is not of course a political group, which is just sort of recognizing that some countries are major emitters nowadays, and that is of course a part of these major economic meetings and the Bush administration has launched as a process and will be kept in a way by the Obama administration, and that I think is now recognized as a real value. This group of countries were until now quite negative on never wanting to take any commitments is really moving, and part of the new ideas which were on the table at Poznan, like in Bali, but even more in Poznan, were clearly originating from South Africa, Mexico, South Korea, which of course as a sort of new actor, but Brazil in a way, and some other countries. So there is a sort of multipolarity which is clearly, you can clearly perceive in the climate negotiation, which is I think a very positive element, because it is not an agreement we can get between US, Europe and Japan. Of course, we have to have China, even if China was still more clearly on the defensive mode than on the positive mode, such like India. But you see that there are new forces who will really be very important in the framing of the deal. And what was interesting is that, for example, and coming back again to what Nicola said, there is really a strong commitment for developing countries, and China has been very vocal on that, on keeping Kyoto processes in the Kyoto Protocol separated from the discussion under the convention until the end. And it was very clear that because China doesn't want to be included too early in a process where China has to take a commitment. So for this reason, China was quite negative. But so new forces, new countries, and in a way, again, a not very comfortable situation for Europe because of this silent US and relatively silent Japan, and not having the umbrella countries, Australia, Canada, very active as well. So we now have a new scene where these new emerging countries will be quite vocal. What is repetitive in this discussion? Again, I don't think for the moment Europe, or of course US by force, couldn't break the G77 group seriously. So we cannot for the moment break the classical North-South divide on different responsibilities, a common and differentiated responsibility, on the finance, on the commitments. So that is quite repetitive, and in a way we are not able in a way to really break that sort of tradition in the climate discussion. What is new? Part of what is new is what I have referred to, the new countries, and I will come to their proposal. But what of course was very new in Poznan was a signal given by the representative of elected President Obama. And John Kerry, as well as Al Gore, have said very important things, both in private meetings. I've had the privilege to have a separate discussion with John Kerry, or in press conference, or speaking in front of the plenary, to say that first, US was ready to re-engage in the negotiations. That means a very concrete issue that even if in his different speeches, President Obama, and of course if you look at the bills were prepared or are on the Senate, or table in the Senate, coming back in 2020 to the 1990 level, which was sort of the number Obama has been expressing, is clearly not a negotiating position. That was very clear from Kerry's point of view, that US has to go further. And that's the first time I listened to any US heavyweight saying that. And that, I think, was quite new. The second new thing was, I think, from US and from Al Gore, from Kerry as well, was the idea that you cannot solve that if the head of state are not involved. And clearly, there is a call for having one meeting or several meetings of head of states to really tackle the issue. And the third point, which was referred to much more by Kerry, is that they are very conscious that they need a bilateral discussion with China if something positive must be found in Copenhagen. So I think I thought that what was very new was the clarity of the US new incoming power, the clarity of the stakes, the clarity of the necessity for them to move further, and the clarity of the discussion they have to have with China. And I think that's quite positive. What are the main, I think, gaps and shortfalls? I think looking at the different issues, and particularly the shared vision exercise, we see that really we are not near any consensus on the numbers, on the midterm objective for 2020. And what was very striking is that, and I think that really, from my point of view, and it's a very personal view, we didn't want to share that in IDDRI, but it is our view on the potential deal. That if we keep with this burden sharing approach, which was of course the base of Kyoto, how you share efforts, how you divide the carbon budget for 2050, how you look at the medium-term objective in terms of how much you do on the developed side and how much you do on the developing side, I think that really is a bad thing. It has been clearly stated on the shared vision that the numbers that have been tabled by some not official report like IPCC, but some scientific work of some searchers of IPCC on the 15 to 30 deviation from the base, from the business as usual baseline for developing countries was not a scientific figure. It was a political attitude to share efforts between the developing countries and the developing ones. Brazil, for example, has been very vocal on saying it's not 2050 to 40, there is not this space for discussion for the efforts of developing countries. It's a political decision, it's a political decision of the burden sharing, and developing countries has to do at least 40% of reduction by 2020, and on the domestic base, not on offsetting. So you saw that the numbers, the play with the numbers, indicate that it will be a very difficult discussion, and there is no shared vision of the efforts. In a way, we should think maybe a little more on which was the attempt of IPCC, and why IPCC put the numbers on the fourth report, was clearly to try to change the framework of having a burden sharing approach to discussion and negotiation of the emission pathways. We know the arrival point. The arrival point is halving by 50 the global emissions. If we follow mixed arithmetics, we can see that it is about 2 tons per capita in 2050. And the problem is how you get there with very different emission pathways. Countries will grow, will see their emission grow, and the problem is when they will peak and when they will go down. And it's very different among countries. And that is, of course, a discussion which is unfortunately moving again to the burden sharing approach and not moving for the moment, but I'm not pessimistic, on the emission pathways negotiation. And this notion of when countries will overshoot, looking at this 2050 and how they may compensate their overshooting is clearly a discussion we have to have with the US, for example. So there is an issue there on the numbers of the shared vision, and that is then on the form of the agreement and what we will negotiate on the emission trajectories. I see a good element, a sort of precondition of success on the mitigation processes where we have now a vision, and South Africa, for example, and Mexico, for example, and surprisingly Brazil, for example, in Poznan, a stable method to measure mitigation policies in developing countries as a way to frame their commitments. And I think that's quite a very interesting step forward. I don't want to be too long, but my feeling is that what will be really one of the more difficult problems of the agreement in Copenhagen is that we have to find a formal agreement who in a way respect the sovereignty of the development choices which are the core of the energy and climate policies in any country, because it's about, of course, the transport policy, urban policies, energy policy. That's really, and that is very clearly stated by China, it's our own policy. We want to decide what we want to do inside. And that has been tabled as a very strong argument for India as well. The Indians even say, if the international community asks us for more, we will do less. An international commitment, a binding commitment, will finally be a negative incentive for us to achieve more. And in a way, being so many weeks in China, normally each year, and particularly this year, I have the same sense. Chinese government, and it's go up to the leadership, says they want to go to the low carbon economy. They don't want to commit internationally to a low carbon economy. They want to do it because they said that it is mainly in their interest, but they don't want to have any binding commitments to do so. And the problem of the catch-22 process is that the US want to commit to do something, but they want China to commit to do something either. So that's not a sort of perfectly easy position for US, because they don't want as well the sort of binding elements to look at their domestic policy. And in a way, the problem of it's both a legal and a political problem. How you shape an agreement who respects this sovereignty. The problem of really is the enforcement nature embedded in national institutions, with somehow a capacity of the international community to compare, to measure, but as well to look at your internal policy. And are making the comparison with a trade negotiation. Well, I think we are in the same problem. Trade negotiation now goes so deep in domestic policies that it is more and more difficult to get an agreement. Climate policies, if we want something meaningful to be achieved, has to go very deep in domestic policies, and then the sovereignty argument is a very strong one. So I don't know, and we have a distinguished legal expert here and politists that could find the solution, but I think that the mainstay we have in front of us to design something acceptable in Copenhagen. So that was mainly the elements that I would like to table. That's very interesting how you see how these emerging countries, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico mainly, and South Korea, are beginning to make proposals. I think it's a concern for EU because we have to be proactive again. How main proactive action was, of course, to negotiate and to bring the EU energy climate package to the negotiation. That's fortunately over, and that's, I think, a big success. We could discuss on the substance of the package, but in the discussion. But I think now we have to be much more proactive in the area of finance and technology, and of course of this picture of the agreement. And I think that's a very key issue if we want to preserve some kind of leadership with a very fresh and very active new administration from the US, who now came into the game very early. Finally, the positive signal coming from the US guys was that even if everybody was very pessimistic on the capacity to reach an agreement in December, the message from Kerry and Gore was, we have time. We have time to be prepared to find an agreement in December in Copenhagen, which I think is very important as a political signal. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and perhaps that's one of the points in the discussions that we can perhaps pursue, what the role of the EU will be in this major game between the US and China and India perhaps, and whether the EU wouldn't be squeezed in that game when perhaps the big ones agree that really binding commitments don't carry us anyway forward. But that's for the discussion. Perhaps what I wanted to throw into the discussion also, I don't know whether it was on one of your slides, Nicola, but I think Australia made an announcement on Monday, a very far-reaching target of reducing their emissions by 5% by 2020, with a commitment to increase that to 15 if there's an international agreement, plus an emissions trading system that, if you look at the cornerstones of the proposals, you will appreciate a lot the EU progress during this past week. But it's also something to be perhaps considered. I definitely don't want to give a further speech. So I would like to open the floor for questions, please. Over there.
Yeah, I have two questions, and maybe I begin with one small remark. I was also in Poznan with the negotiations, and I'd just like to add that the IPCC scientists and developing countries were very disappointed at the EU package the last day, and the NGOs were extremely outraged at the package. And I have two questions which will make that more clear. With the current EU package, the door stands open for 60%, 66% of external reductions instead of domestic reductions, which means that the EU will only have to reduce its domestic emissions with 4% from here to 2020, because they already reduced 9%. Now, together with the 9%, that makes 13% reductions, while IPCC asks for 25 to 40% domestic reductions. And this will lead, if everybody would follow the EU ETS package, up to a 4°C rise in global temperature, which has been calculated, if everybody follows the example of the EU, while the EU is still thinking to reach a 2°C target. Now, my question is, if 60%, 66% outsourcing of pollution is possible, is it still compatible with the EC Treaty Article 174, the principle which was being shown on the slide, the rectification at source? Is it still compatible with 60% external reductions? That's question one. And if you don't mind, I have one more. The developing countries have received access to an empty box of only 1% of adaptation money, which is actually needed according to UN figures. It's just 1% of what is needed they have access to. So it's not a big achievement, I think. Remarkable is that you mentioned in your speech that the reason for not extending the share of proceeds to fund this adaptation fund, to put more money in it, is that it would be better to tax pollution than tax the reduction of pollution. Now, I totally agree with that, but then I find it very strange that although the NP has proposed to earmark 50% of the revenue of the auctioning of pollution from the EU, to put that money, 50%, into a fund for mitigation and adaptation in developing countries, well, that was not adopted in the EU. So why doesn't the EU practice what it teaches?
Thanks very much. Interesting questions. Any further questions for the first round? Please, don't hesitate. The speakers will not want after the presentation to stay here half an hour again to have bilaterals. No further questions, then I'll give perhaps first Nicola the chance to react. Dan back.
If you let me just about this concept of historical responsibility, as you mentioned. I think from the legal point of view it lacks any ground whatsoever, because this general principle of legality, which we know that the emissions were not considered wrong at the time when they were emitted. So I'm surprised that the developed world accepts this argument, which is false, basically. And from the economic point of view, if you look at the leading economists, actually like Nobel Prize winners, they say that we will have to reform our economies anyway. So the world economy needs reform. It has to be put on the green rail. And now you are misguiding those poor underdeveloped countries who are actually expanding their dirty production systems and expanding their dirty economy, which will have to be pulled down and which will have to be reconstructed at the end. So it's like a waste of effort and resources. So I think this argument is inherently false.
Oh, there's the third one. We take it from the third one.
Getting bolder with more questions. Well, I was interested by a remark by Mr. Notaro that there will be further plans, there will be further targets, further climate packages. And I'd be very interested to know more about this, because what strikes me is that the science, the policy making is not catching up fast enough with the science. If this package was strong enough, and we have doubts that it is, to put us in a path towards 150 ppm, that would still not be enough. So, but it is not even strong enough to do that. So, I'd be interested to know what the next steps could be, and when, beyond the strategic energy review and some of the elements you mentioned.
You want to add? Later. Okay. Then I'll give the floor to Nicola first.
Thank you. Well, first of all, on the package, I really do not understand. I really do not understand the attitude of green NGOs. a block of 27 industrialized countries have agreed to cut their emission by 20 to 30%. And this is considered either as an underachievement or as insignificant or as a terrible event. So I really do not understand that. The emissions cuts, even if they happen outside the EU, will be emission cuts, will not be just fake emission cuts. So the idea of leading to a 4 degrees world is completely ill-founded. The IPCC does not say that the 20 to 40% should be achieved domestically only. So that's not the correct fact. Sorry? 25% to 40. So that's not something that excludes cuts outside. In fact, I agree with the principle that there should be more cuts domestically. The Commission proposal had more cuts domestically, and the Council have inserted more flexibility. Now, this flexibility, you have to also consider that is not necessarily going to be used. It's a possibility that exists under the legislation, but it's not necessarily going to be used. We'll have to see to what extent it will be. And the extent to which it will be used will depend largely to the price, in fact, to the carbon prices. So it's at this moment quite unpredictable. I don't know about the principle of ratification at source. It's an interesting point that you are making there, absolutely. On the other hand, the principle of ratification at source, in fact, doesn't really match very well with the fact that it doesn't matter for climate change where you cut emission, but what matters is that emissions are cut. That's the idea that underpins any emission trading scheme. Even within the EU, you could think of, okay, you should cut emissions in Germany rather than in France, where they are higher. But in fact, for climate change, overall, if globally emissions are cut, it doesn't really matter. That's the important fact. It doesn't really matter where it happens. So I would say that principle maybe is at odds with some parts of climate change policy. The access to the adaptation fund, it's very clear. Everybody agrees that that fund is completely insufficient for the adaptation needs. We have a few months ahead of us to come up with a concrete proposal that we start addressing the issue of the adaptation needs. That's clear. But in any event, at least that fund, with those monies that will go into it, will be now operational and will make some projects funded and available in developing countries as of now, rather than as of 5 years. The auctioning revenues, yeah, of course. I mean, it was one of the major elements of the Commission proposals, but it is not gone out of the text. In fact, there is a possibility in the compromise that was found in the Council to use up to 50% of the auctioning revenues for the fight against climate change, including in developing countries. However, this is not a hard obligation. So it will be for member states to decide how they use the auctioning revenue. It has not disappeared from the text. It was not compulsory in the Commission proposal in any event, and the figure we had put in was 20%. And now the figure is actually higher, I believe, thanks to the European Parliament. So there is a revenue-generating mechanism which is there. I think that's very fortunate, that's very positive. But how the money will actually be used, of course, remains to be seen, because it's a choice that member states wanted to be master of. Then, I'm not sure on the other, yes, on the question of historical responsibility, yes, of course, it doesn't make any sense legally, I would agree entirely with you. But this is not about legal questions, this is about political and moral responsibilities. It's quite clear that in our 150 years of pollution, for a long time we were not aware of the consequences of putting into the atmosphere greenhouse gases and CO2 in particular. So, of course, we don't necessarily want to be blamed for errors made in the past. On the other hand, it has been done by our countries. So we have to face that responsibility. It's a moral responsibility that I think the EU as a group of developed countries must face. On further packages, yes, as I said, we may be disappointed by the current package, but that's the beginning. There is a system which is in place, and it's the European Climate Change Programme, through which a lot of the proposals that have come through the pipeline so far have been discussed with stakeholders and developed and put forward. And this will continue. Now, probably we'll not call it any longer the ECCP, but it will be called essentially the implementation of the package, which has two strands. One is the ETS, which is in place, and the other one is the effort sharing decision. To deliver the targets under the effort sharing decision, it is quite clear that new policies will be developed, and in fact there are studies that have been launched already about a year ago on all the sectors that will be covered and the proposals that should be envisaged. So it's a discussion that is going to be launched in 2009 on the implementation of the Just Agreed decision. And as I said, I can well anticipate a number of packages in the next few years. There are lots of sectors where there is more to be achieved. There's transport, there's agriculture, beyond the industrial sector that are covered already by the ETS. But let's say even the plan is in the making at present. There's not much more that I can say.
Good.
Laurence?
I think, of course, the real question of the package, politically it's very important, because when you look back, and I think Nicola was right to look back at the 11 months, when this discussion began with the Commission proposal and the German presidency, we were in a huge disarray in the EU. It was not a good political momentum, if you remember well. It was really a period where Europe was really not very united, where even on the, and I remember discussion with at that time the Director of Environment and the Commissioner, everybody was thinking about the renationalization of environment policies. It was a period where really, even on the ETS reform, there was a sense that if you touch one aspect, everything will be broken up, because countries were now resisting against this sort of movement to go always further in the environment policy. So on that side, I think that's a very big political achievement from these 11 months. Said that, and I think the question is the economic signal that will be provided by the package be sufficient to really give incentive to go to the low carbon economy? That's a question. I'm not, for the moment, really convinced that it is enough for the whole set of reasons that have been said, mainly the auctioning part, mainly because I think it will be very difficult not to overfed the industrial sector with free allowance. So I do think there is a problem there on the capacity to generate an economic sector, an economic signal really gives the direction. And for this reason, it would be very important to see, to be very, I think, and I am relatively worried about the capacity of linking the EU emission trading market with the US trading market, because we can face a sort of not a very strong incentive structure, even, and above all, if we link that to an emission trading market in the US will not be strong enough in terms of the carbon price. That means, again, that if we don't get the signal enough on the emission trading parameter, then we have to do a lot on the outside of the ETS, which is not that easy on transport, on building, on the efficiency, energy efficiency. So that makes the communication and the directive of energy efficiency very important as an output. So my concern is this one. I don't know how we can reinforce. I'm not that worried about the capacity of EU buying all this emission outside. I think this number of 66% is is a political number. I don't see any possibility from now, we are in 2008, 2009, to the capacity to 2020 to generate so much credit. I don't know what Nicola is thinking, but most probably it will not be possible easily to find a real reduction outside in such a number. But on the other side, if you look differently, it can be a tool for EU to be a supportive region for the efforts of developing countries' policy. So you can in a way find a sort of positive element in that, even if, again, I'm quite worried about this thing here. On the, I think the response on common and differentiated responsibilities, of course, is a political commitment. I don't know what kind of force it has. It's now in a convention, in a treaty, in a second treaty with this Kyoto Protocol, and in a number, I think, of treaties we have been ratifying in environmental terms. So I don't know what kind of I'm an economist, so I don't know nothing about the legal aspect. But I understand it's a tricky thing, but it's again not only moral, but it has sort of a ground, something we sign off. So we have to comply with it in a way. Interestingly enough, and I will end with that, the way that IPCC had changed the vision of the historic on the common and differentiated responsibility is that the differentiated, of course, part of it has been mainly on the discussion from in Kyoto and all these years. The common one is exactly because we realize that we have that much carbon budget for 2050, and that even if the developed countries will emit zero or have even negative emissions, buying a lot outside, the developing countries has to do their part. So the common aspect now is because of this new vision given by the scientific community, I think sort of make a sort of an equilibrium, a better equilibrium in the formula, in the way we use the formula common and differentiated.
Thank you. If I can make one comment on the 66% figure, one indeed wonders whether people have thought about how many credits could be available if they are not paper credits, if the EU achieves its target of Copenhagen Agreement with developing country action. So where are all the cheap credits supposed to come from? But if that is the case, then one also wonders what the political wisdom is of signaling to industry that they can buy their way out from outside, instead of rather saying you need to move to a low carbon economy. Sorry. But okay. As I said, I don't want to dominate the discussion here. I think there was already one further question, please.
I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. I wonder what you would recommend. In one of the newspapers this morning, the new American Energy Secretary, it was said, he said recently, we're heading to 6 degrees of climate change. I tend to agree with most of the comments made about the criticisms made of the package agreed this week. But on the other hand, we've got no choice. So, you know, more specifically, what's your own feeling about the prospects of Article 2 of the Framework Convention being met? Will we avoid dangerous climate change? Thank you.
Let the speakers think for a minute, so I hope there will be another question. Please.
Thank you for interesting presentations. One aspect which I would like you to think, if it is possible at all, but this whole process is very much top-down. It's the states, it's the United Nations, and as we know, therefore it's very, very risky. So I fully agree with the problem of sovereignty, because that means that you allow egoism. So isn't there any way of picking from down about the worry of people, small communities, kind of micro systems which would get this kind of support? So has this to be so much top down?
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, maybe I like to respond to the answer of Mr. Nicola Notaro first. one of the things you mentioned is that these CDM constructions, flexibility are real reductions. But a lot of studies show that 30 to 50% is actually not a real reduction. Actually, at 1 October 2008, 67% of the projects which received CDM credits, at the moment when they received it, the project was already built. And there are some, indeed, examples that, of course, like in the metro system in Delhi, it was already built and then they did some projects, so they reduced it. Okay, there are exceptions, but still, it's a figure which makes you think. And recent research in India has shown that a doctorate student from Berkeley University has interviewed a lot of bankers in India, and not one of them thinks of CDM money coming in when he decides to loan money to a big developer. Not one of them. So additionality is a big problem, I think. So that's your response, my response to your idea that all these reductions are real. And at Poznan, the EU has proposed to improve the CDM system, which is good, because they insisted that the verification of the project should become under the UN Secretariat, which would indeed be better than at present, when the project developers are actually paying the ones who are controlling them. But China totally refused this, so the system stays as it is. So on one hand, you have the system which is not working, EU knowing that it doesn't work, trying to change it, not succeeding, and at the same time expanding at home in Europe. So my response to that. And then my one question, which I still have, which exceptions did Italy get from the EU package? On what grounds, your country? And if they get it, why not other countries?
Nicola, whatever you make of that.
Yes, well, as you might have noticed, I'm not a representative of the Italian government. You might go and ask them. And in any event, it's not Italy only who got exceptions and derogations. So all of the member states fought hard to defend their own economic interests. So I guess Italy is not particularly smarter than others. I think what they got is probably comparable to what others will get. And also we have to see how a political agreement in European Council conclusions will be translated into amendments to the legislation. So to see the exact effect, that's a little bit still in development. So I'll advise you to address yourself to the Italian embassy. For the CDM, it's clear that there are drawbacks in the current system. I think there are many studies, and many studies that are not particularly reliable. In fact, on criticism on CDM, there are problems. It's something that it's openly recognized, and as you rightly pointed out, this is the reason why we suggest improvements. But the package we're talking about is a package for post-2012, in fact. So what we are envisaging is an improved CDM as part of the post-Kyoto regime. So what we want is, if member states would indeed decide to use this possibility of buying credits, increased possibilities under the package, is that they buy credible credits under any new international agreement that would be agreed. So that's why, in a way, we are fighting on two fronts, if you like. So I don't see a difficulty there in reconciling these two approaches. Very difficult are the two questions really on top-down or being optimistic or pessimistic. I think the process is not entirely top-down. Yes, certainly, of course, it's a negotiation among states, but there is a big stakeholders involvement in the development of national policies that then build up into the positions of the countries. Maybe, of course, this differs very much from one country to the other. There are countries who have put in place more participatory processes and others who haven't. But when you want to bring together the global community, really there is no alternative, at present at least, to the UN system, with all its inefficiencies and drawbacks, which I think everybody recognizes. If you've been to a conference of the parties, when you go there for the first time, you really get very frustrated, because you're like, what are these people doing here? It seems they're all just losing their time. And maybe to some extent they are, but the achievements that we are after take a long time. And think of the huge, the sheer diversity of people and countries that are brought under the UN framework, and then you'll understand that it's extremely difficult. On being optimistic or pessimistic, I can only give you my take, which is you may choose to be pessimistic, then you just sit and wait for the catastrophe to arrive. That helps nobody, and it doesn't make you feel better. So my approach is I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic that what we do contributes to indeed fight against climate change, and that we still have a chance to prevent the most catastrophic effects of it. If I believed otherwise, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. I'm not quite sure, though, that we will fulfill Article 2 of the Convention. There are some dangerous consequences of climate change that are already there and are unavoidable, and we just have to face them. And the fact is that we are in a relatively privileged position because it's easier to face dangerous consequences when you have some money in your pocket, because you can build some defensive mechanisms. Whilst a number of others, as I mentioned before, particularly Africa and least developed countries, will not have that chance.
Thank you, Sebastian. On the optimism, I think that it is really the Pascalian variable. Anyway, we have to do it, try. We have not a lot of choices. The element of credibility that this tremendous activity is worth doing it is that, in a way, looking back at Stockholm and then at Rio and then at Kyoto, we see that the prospect of really a deep, a profound change in the development pathways is now sort of evidence. Not shared by everybody, but you don't find, well, you find some governments still resisting. But even in the big country like China, I will not say India as well, but in private, you will understand that important Indian leaders believe that that's not possible to get the same development pathway than in West or in Europe. So there is this growing understanding that there is a war, that profound changes has to be operated, but of course the political process to get there, the representation of what it is about, what does it look like, so low carbon economy, we of course understand that's a very still abstract idea. So I think the positive element is that progressively everybody understands that the traditional way to go is really like in this very beautiful painting of Goya, where you see two men fighting in a, je ne sais pas comment dire, marais, the mud. So we are in a way in that situation. Are we able to get out of it? I think now the political representation is building up, and not top down, the bottom up, of course, quite clearly. And I see now the countries and the groups and the business and the local municipalities playing with the idea of how we can go there. What is a low carbon economy and how we get there? I feel very deeply what is really at stake is I don't think that even in Europe governments know exactly what kind of political tools they have to go there. Discussing with a number of people these days, you see that for leaders, I think for France, for our very energetic president, so energetic, it's quite sort of, sometimes it's difficult to follow him. Even I don't think clearly he has an idea of where to go there. And that's the same for Gordon Brown, that's the same for Mrs. Merkel. What do they have in hand? They have very few tools on land management. They have in the past, they don't have that much. When I look at France or UK, for example, they don't have really strong tools on industrial policy, because that's over, liberalization, globalization. What they know to handle is about macroeconomic policy, exchange rates, credit to the economy. That's the major tools they have for the moment. And the other ones, the sort of structural tools to change the development pathways, we have to recognize that's something which was maybe in their hands in the 1960s, in the 1950s, but now they are not in their hands because we have this global economy, the competitiveness between territories, etc. So I think what the positive aspect is we see that we have to go there. There is some kind of agreement on this representation, and it's all over the society. It's not always in special circles. Of course, it's not shared in India or China, but it's coming. But the problem I see is we don't know how other tools within this global economy. And my final comment will be that, in a way, this crisis offers an opportunity, which may be a sort of wishful thinking. But I do think looking at the Chinese rescue package or the US rescue package, even more than the French one, which is not particularly green, but the other ones has a good deal of vision of how the change they want to introduce in the economy. And I think that's the way. We have enough time to do that? Well, I'm not that optimistic, but I think the direction is there, but the speed is not there.
Thank you very much. Some thoughts to reflect upon, I guess, and there's a period coming where there's a lot of time for reflection, I hope, for all of us. But let's first give some applause to our speakers. Thank you very much for coming and giving your thoughts on these issues. I repeat the announcement that I made at the beginning. Josp Del Beke will talk on the 21st of January at 6 p.m. on the EU Climate and Energy Package in room 003 next doors. And registration at our website will be open from about tomorrow. So please register. And with that, I hope to see you in the new year. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.